Hi everyone, my name's Tom Haynes. I'm from Before Motion. Today what I'm going to be talking about is butt wink. So the little flick of the hips that happens in the bottom of the squat, roughly when you hit about parallel, that weird sort of sensation when the butt essentially winks under you. You go into lumbar flexion and posterior tilt. And usually it only happens somewhere around 9 degrees plus of the squat. So what I want to do today is just talk about why it happens, and ways you can kind of get around it or at least train around it at this point here, because it's an anomaly that occurs more so because of the starting position rather than a technical thing. So there are ways that we can move around it to stop it from happening and help increase performance, because at the end of the day, we don't want to have like a part of the body that's moving out of our control. We want everything to be moving within like a systemic kind of movement, like everything's flowing together. So I think the first thing we're going to go through today is talk about the different parts of the spine. So if you look at this little fun drawing here from the side on view, if you look at his eyes and mouth facing forward, you got 3 aspects of the spine. And in most humans, in terms of our sagittal competency or our like sort of forward backwards kind of balance, it tends to present in a bit of like an S shape like this, or a reverse S shape. So the top here around our neck, we've got our cervical spine. In the middle, sort of our upper back, we heard this one, thoracic spine. And then down the bottom, we've got the lumbar here. So this presentation here is quite common with a lot of people, mostly just because it's how the body finds it the easiest way to kind of balance our center of mass or center of gravity. So you won't find everyone presents like this, but generally speaking, if you've done a lot of barbell training, you're probably going to present in this more extended part of the lumbar spine, a little bit more rounded to the thoracic, and a little bit more extended through the cervical or the neck again. So once again, this isn't everyone, but this is a good example of sort of what a lot of humans will present with. And you can generally see it from yourself and take a photo of yourself side on, or just look at yourself in the mirror side on and kind of relax. You can see roughly where your spinal curves sit. And it can give you a little bit of information about how your body stands or how your body kind of presents in the top of like an extended position. So if we move on to the next bit here, we can talk about what extension and flexion is. So generally speaking, if you kind of have like a full, like look at the body as a full unit, on the left here, we've got full extension. So that's imagining where the body is extending back, the ribs are coming up, the lower back's arch, and everything's moving into the extension position where everything comes back and up. Imagine like a bench press position is a good example of an extended position. And on the other side here, we've got full flexion. So we've got the body is more so rounding out as a unit. We've got knee flexion, hip flexion, lumbar flexion. We've kind of got the rib cage moving backwards a little bit. Like the body's more so moving into a rounded position. And if you look at that, it kind of ends up being a squat. So I guess the kind of point that I'm making here is that when we are doing a squatting pattern, our body does have to move into some kind of flexion. And ideally, we want the body to be moving as a unit so that there's less kind of force leakage throughout the movement. So we want our whole body to be able to move in and out of flexion quite comfortably. So if you kind of look through these photos here, this is kind of like the descent pattern of a squat, or like the typical kind of descent pattern of a squat for someone that gets butt wink. So on the left here, we've got the starting position where you're starting in more of that extended style posture. The lumbar is a bit more extended, the rib cage might be too, maybe a little bit more of like an anterior tilt or a duck, but not necessarily a bad thing. It's more so just something that you can analyze and assess and just give you pieces of information how someone moves. So typically it's quite normal, especially if you've got a barbell sitting here, for that body to be in that more extended starting position. Then as you come sort of onto like halfway down through the descent, a lot of the time with people with butt wink, you'll still see that lumbar sitting in a lot of extension. They're trying to hold that extension as hard as they can because it makes them feel stronger, it makes them feel better. They're concerned for the safety of their spine, those kinds of things. So it's still around this kind of position here. We haven't gone into too much flexion of the squat yet. So the body doesn't need to move into a heap of flexion, so it can still hold that lumbar extension. But then typically what will sort of happen around here, around sort of like the parallel mark, is all of a sudden the hips will flick under into that posterior tilt or that lumbar flexion kind of position. And it's quite interesting because like you think that being able to hold more lumbar extension will get away with it. So you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, maybe my lumbar erectors are just a bit weak or they're not able to hold that position. It's more so the way you can think about it is like I had in that previous slide. To get into a squat, the body generally wants to move towards like a full systemic flexion of the body. So as we're getting lower and roughly around that parallel mark, the body has decided that it needs more flexion somewhere. So it is just going to be dumping the hips under into posterior tilt because the weight is kind of forcing us down. So as we come down lower and lower and lower, we need to satisfy some kind of flexion demands of the movement. And the body finds it's the easiest way to access that in a lot of ways, both through the legs and the lower back. It's just to dump the hips under into that butt wink position. And it's not often the nicest feeling, or it's not often the most powerful position. It's not necessarily inherently dangerous or anything like that, but it's one of these things that we can clean up to help make a squat feel a bit more efficient, a bit more stronger, and even a little bit better. So one of the things we can do to try and fix it is starting the squat in a bit more of a flexed lumbar position. So if you imagine you're standing tall at the top of the squat, what you want to think about doing is trying to tuck your hips under you as much as you can. So actually going into that posterior pelvic tilt, that little bit of lumbar flexion at the starting position. The main reason for that is that if we start in more of a flexed position, or a relatively flexed position, like we're not arching our backs as hard as we can, we already have the required amount of flexion that we need to hit about parallel in the squat. So it means that by the time we get around to that 90, 100 degrees of hip flexion or parallel in a powerlifting squat, our hips and lumbar are already in a position where we can achieve all the flexion we need to through the lower body. We don't have to get dumped into that flex position because we've been holding the opposite extended position for far too long. So it's something that takes a little bit of practice. It's not dangerous by any means. And this is going to be a video that I make future on about talking how and why lumbar flexion isn't dangerous. But it can be something that takes a little bit of time getting used to, especially if you are used to starting the squat in a bit more of an anterior pelvic tilt or a duck butt. Learning to tuck the hips under can feel quite strange. It can do a lot of other things apart from just getting rid of that butt winking sensation. It can help you feel more legs pushing out of the hole, especially if you find that you use a lot of lower back to try and get out of your squat. It can help you with balance too. If you find that you tend to lean more towards your toes in the bottom position, you start to drift. Starting in more of a tuck position can help you stay on the middle of your foot quite a lot easier, which can make a squat feel stronger. So there's a couple of things as well that like this more posteriorly tilted or lumbar flex starting position can do. It just does take a bit of time to get used to or to feel a bit stronger, especially like coming from a complete opposite position. And there are a few ways as well. Like generally speaking, our recommendation for people starting here is working on more tempo or pause squats to get used to this position, and using accessories to help get used to more lumbar flexion or start to achieve more lumbar flexion. If you look at the previous video beforehand, we were just talking about the adductors. Training the adductors and hip flexion can be a great place to start in terms of learning how to get rid of extension and anterior pelvic tilt that's a bit stuck when it comes to squatting. But otherwise, just practicing the squatting and getting used to that starting position and being really, really strict. So yeah, like I said, I'll be making a further video later on about why lumbar flexion isn't necessarily a bad thing, even though there's a lot of research throughout the years that have said that it might be, just to kind of continue to build confidence in this position for like a movement which is typically considered to be quite bad. So yeah, thanks for watching.